Hello, I'm Bill Leipold, and welcome to this edition of Breakfast at the Barracks. Joining me is Leonard L. Bethel, Associate Professor of Africana Studies at Rutgers, New Brunswick. Welcome, Leonard. How are you?
I'm fine. How are you?
I'm good, thanks. Let's jump right in. I know a lot of your research deals with leadership and the Black experience and African American experience. So can you kind of give me a perspective of what that really means and how that applies to your research?
Well, I've had interest in leadership in the African American community in urban areas around the country, and that interest came about as a result of I'm also an ordained clergy, Presbyterian, and I've pastored at the third oldest African American Presbyterian church in the country in Reading, Pennsylvania. And I had an opportunity to have interaction with African American leaders in Reading, Pennsylvania, Philadelphia, New Brunswick, Plainfield, New Jersey, where I presently live. And I've been able to see some unique patterns and what that means to be a leader in the African American community. It's not a situation where a person comes in with certain qualifications and take over a position, but it's usually from the people. You know, people have jobs, but they're not necessarily leaders. And people have a way of choosing the people that they are willing to follow and listen to and look up to. And they're far and few in between. We don't have as many as we had back during the 60s and the 70s. But there are people who have an impact on people's lives. And what is interesting about this whole thing is we still, when we talk about the African American community in America, it is ironic that in 2010, most African Americans live in all African American communities. And we see some spattered integration in various parts of the country, but most live, you can go to any urban area and it is predominantly African American. I've had an opportunity just growing up, moving into integrated neighborhoods that turn to all African American. And that seems to be a pattern. There is a life there. People choose their leaders, they have their contacts and this kind of thing. There are some diminishing areas like doctors and dentists and so on. And people go out of the community, you know, for that kind of care. And also a kind of diminishing number of teachers, African American teachers in the inner city schools, which are predominantly African American. But there are still those persons who are dedicated in all of the areas that I mentioned, and are kind of looked up to and chosen by the people to, you know, they listen to these people and they don't listen to other people.
What are some of the qualities that folks are looking for? I mean, is there across the board terms of moral values, language skills? I mean, is there some charisma? I'm trying to figure out kind of what.
I think a combination of these things. I think the charisma comes across first, but that easily diminishes after people begin to find out the character of the person. If the person doesn't have a moral standard, doesn't have you know, their personal life is not stable, they're not a visionary, people kind of move away from them. I mean, the shouting, loud talk, and all that comes across first, but people begin to see through all of that and begin to listen to people as they look at them to see what kind of family person they are, what kind of attitude they have about, and how they are willing to sacrifice in dealing with the broader community. You know, if a person is willing to stand up and speak out and say, you know, we have problems and you are tied into the problem and this kind of thing. And knowledge comes into it also. You know, people who have an understanding of the Kerner Commission, that the broader white community is implicated in the black community and this kind of thing, and who has a sense of the world order, like, you know, in African countries, Caribbean countries have implications from Europe and America there. So we live in a world like that. I mean, there's no autonomous situation where people don't have some kind of impact from the broader community. And so we don't have as many leaders today that we had during there seemed to be some kind of spark during the 20th century.
Right.
The post-First World War and going into the 1960s and the kind of leadership that came out of that period, and the sacrifices that people made. They sacrificed their lives, and Martin Luther King, Malcolm X, and people like this.
So what do we think the difference is? I mean, I know there was a lot of conversation in terms of speaking up, but what do we think the difference really attributed to at this particular point?
Well, I think when we begin to really look at this question, it might not be different in the predominantly white community anymore.
Okay.
Because I don't think the predominantly white community across the country is as stable as it was back in the early 20th century. We have a very high divorce rate, and people are looking for leadership, and they're looking for some of the same qualities that people are looking for in the black community.
Right.
Moral standard, visionary, somebody who's willing to sacrifice, somebody who's not in it for the money, you know, and this kind of thing. So we've reached a problem in America with the moral standard. We have that kind of problem. We're looking for moral leadership, and this is true in the black community, and it's true in the white community.
Well, you talked a little bit about, from your perspective, that you're an ordained minister.
Yes.
So how does religion play into the black community and leadership?
Well, it's a major part of this moral question, because we have to go back in traditional African religious behavior. I mean, that's a religion in the traditional sense in Africa was as much it's like a social phenomenon. The sociability of the African complex is tied in with religion.
Right.
And any kind of movement that we've seen in the 20th century where blacks are concerned in dealing with civil rights and so on has come through the leadership of the church.
Well, even currently, I know a lot of politicians, you come into the black church to have lots of conversations.
Well, I've gotten that. When I pastored, always during announcements and during the political period, there was some politician would be sitting there, white and black, and they stood up and asked to make an announcement.
Right.
So, you know, there's an understanding that there's some power locally in the black church as far as votes are concerned and that kind of thing. And some of our most astute leadership in the 20th century has come out of the church, and Adam Clayton Powell, and, you know, that kind of thing. So it's not divorced. The whole the religious perspective is not divorced from church orientation. And one of the phenomenons that I think is unique to America, it might be unique in the non-Western world, is that within the whole concept of Christendom, we have there's still a sense of isolation. I mean, we live in a country where we say we are a democracy. We're not a pure democracy, but most blacks worship in all black churches.
Correct.
Most whites worship in all white churches.
Right.
And that is still a phenomenon with this whole question of a democracy. And there are a few white preachers who are sensitive to this and who can speak to black congregations. Most can't.
Right.
You know.
Well, let's talk about that for a little bit, because I know there's a lot of conversations around black language or black dialect or black linguistics in terms of intonation, voice, and so there's a whole conversation that people have or thoughts about what folks have in terms of the language in black church as opposed to languages in a white church predominantly. What are some of those differences, and kind of how do we talk about those?
Well, I think when you look at the white church, we're talking about denominations. I mean, in certain denominations where requirement is for college degrees and seminary degrees, like the Episcopal Church and the Presbyterian Church and so on, there's a certain kind of language, you know. People are trained in homiletics, and they're trained in, you know, with John Calvinism and John Wesley and all of that. They deliver themselves in a certain way. They're one of the unique things in the black church, let's say in the black Presbyterian church, now the largest church is the Baptist church in the black community. Some black Baptist ministers are trained in terms of college and seminary, a good number are not. But all black clergy are cued into the whole notion of expression in the black church. For example, in the predominantly white church, the word Christ is used more. In the Protestant church, Christ. In the black community, Jesus is used.
Correct.
You know, and that's because, you know, in the old African of John S. and Beatty says it best, that there's a difference between Jesus and Christ in the African experience. Jesus is the anthropocentric person. He's related, he relates to the human experience and is alive in that sense.
All right.
And so when the Gospels are preached, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, in the black church, you know, when the preacher says Jesus, people respond. When they say Christ, it doesn't, they don't get the same kind of response. So the language is, is a little bit different. Okay. Some white preachers have caught on to this, where they speak to black audiences so they can get a better response, you know, out of that. There's something that we're getting to in this country that we need to talk about. We speak the same language with different meanings.
Yes.
Between blacks and whites, you know, that's coming together. This generation is mixing it up on where they're understanding one another, but blacks and whites. Just like a facial expression. In the black community, when you wear a mustache and there's something around here they call Van Dyke. Okay. In the black community called goatee. Right. So it's different kinds of these, you know, these various expressions, just in physiognomy, you know, has its unique pattern. And to understand that in talking to groups and so on. Now I can talk to a predominantly white group because I know this. Okay. I have 2 theology degrees, and
so you can kind of,
yeah, I can go. I mean, if I'm talking to an all-white audience and I say something like, I say Van Dyke. If I'm talking to black, I say goatee. Okay. And so I know, I'm quite sure white preachers are able to do this, and but not that many. All right. But we, I guess there's something good about this culturally, but there's something also negative. Okay, where we live in a democracy and we're not communicating. We don't know one another. All right. People who live in the inner city don't have a communication with the predominantly white community. And most whites tend to move to those areas with all the stereotypes and so on, don't want to live, you know, blacks and whites don't live together. So our education reflects that kind of pattern because of the schools, the public schools and so on. Our churches reflect that kind of pattern. And so America is still very youthful in that sense. We're still not a nation, not a true democracy.
Because we're still learning all those things.
Yeah, we're still not a true democracy because of that. Because you have all of these people from all over the world living here. Right. Some came because they were escaping poverty. Some came in chains, slaves, and so on. But we're all here together, and we still haven't learned how to live together.
How to communicate, how to live.
We don't know how to communicate and how to live together. We still have that problem. Okay. And so I hear among educated blacks now, because of some of the experiences that they have had going to Rutgers or Princeton, whatever, they want to send their children to black colleges. They say, you know, they said, let's rejuvenate, you know, the black colleges, because I don't want my kid to go through what I had to go through. And you know, it felt very isolated in campus life and so on. I mean, right here at Rutgers, it's so interesting. We have black Greeks and white Greeks. That's an interesting concept in fraternity, sorority. They all use Greeks, but one black and one white. The black Greeks are very, the structure is different in the graduate program. Right. And they don't own anything. They don't have a place. They don't have a house on campus. So they have to go to the student center, and they have their social activities there.
But there's much more of a community sense in terms of community organizations. They tend to be a lot more connected to their alumni, a lot more connected to their community, more so than the white fraternities.
But not necessarily, because it's set up differently. Okay. Black Greeks do not. The black Greeks at Rutgers do not have very limited number of black Greeks who have graduated they communicate with. The graduate chapters are set up with the Greeks who live in the community. They could be from Morehouse or from Spelman, the black colleges, you see, or from Lincoln University and so on. But Rutgers, white Greeks are all Rutgers graduates. And that's why they buy the house, and so the black Greeks feel isolated on campus because we don't have this. We don't have houses. We don't, and the alumni. And it's interesting. The graduate chapters don't because most of them are made up of graduates of other colleges, don't feel loyal to Rutgers, and they're not going to give money to build anything over here.
Well, this has been a really interesting conversation. Unfortunately, our time has run out.
Okay.
I would love to have you back to get more into this conversation.
Okay, fine.
But that's all we have time for now, so thanks for coming on the show. I appreciate it. Joining me is Jorge Reyna Chimend, Dean in the School of Communications and Information at Rutgers, New Brunswick. Welcome, Jorge.
Thank you.
I want to jump right in because you have a very interesting background. You've written for the FCC in terms of information around ethnic ownership, especially of communication and television and media outlets. Can you give me a little bit of perspective of kind of where you stand with that and kind of what your perspective is with that?
Well, it's been a very up and down story. In the mid-20th century, there were many more media outlets owned by minorities than there are today.
Okay.
What happened in the last 20 years is there was a great deal of consolidation. That consolidation produced bigger outlets, but that created a greater demand for large amounts of capital. And minority owners tended to not have as easy a time getting that amount of capital. And so they tended to lose out to large corporations that now own almost all of the cable outlets, for example, all of the mainstream newspapers, magazines. So the notion of minority ownership, which we have believed for years, is very important because as you were talking about earlier, the leadership in a community has to be integrated. It also has to know about itself, and that's what media provides. So we face some real challenges today.
Well, one of the challenges that I might see, or I kind of have noticed on television, is lack of representation of different ethnic groups. I think we have specialized channels that are dedicated to certain ethnic groups, minorities, genders, but we're not really inclusive on televisions in terms of the four major networks, Fox included at this point.
You know, television has become an arena of neighborhoods, and the mainstream neighborhoods tend to focus on what we would call Anglo or white culture.
Right.
There are other smaller neighborhoods that include more on-air faces that are not white or not Anglo. On the other hand, there's so much more content today that you're much more likely to see a diversity of faces today than you were, say, 30 or 40 years ago.
Let's also talk about diversity in terms of not just media outlets, but news outlets.
Okay.
I find it interesting on the 24-hour news channels, or even on the regular channels, that we still tend to see a lot of white anchors. We still tend to see a lot of white reporters. We're not seeing a perspective from lots of different folks across the media outlets, specifically news.
I mean, what's changed is that the gender representation has changed. You're much more likely to see women in mainstream outlets than you were before, and that's all to the good. What you don't see so much is African Americans or Latinos in positions of seniority, for example. So even a fairly liberal network like MSNBC in the evening, where they have all their political shows, African Americans show up as guests.
Right.
And that's it.
I was just going to say, MSNBC in the evening is all white.
That's right.
For the most part, it's all white on CNN, and even all white on Fox. Where you even start looking at the 24-hour news channels, prime time seems to be one color.
Well, and they're swimming against the demographic wave.
Okay.
So in the course of the 21st century, the first half of the 21st century, the numbers and percentages of Asians, Latinos, and African Americans are going to grow, and they're going to grow much faster than the numbers and percentages of whites or Anglos. So this year, for example, is the year that some of us in demography think, it'll either be this year or next year, that the percentage of white babies born will drop below 50%.
Let's also talk a little bit about the census. The last census, we saw a growing, specifically Latino and Chicano population, especially in what folks might see as non-traditional states. Illinois, Iowa,
Michigan, North Carolina,
New Jersey,
Iowa, Kentucky, New Jersey.
And so the conversation now is, on this new census, we expect to see that Latino population and Chicano population grow even more.
Even more.
But we're not going to see that representation right away on television.
Well, I think television turns out to be, unlike what it thinks of itself, producers tend to be lagging indicators of social change rather than leading indicators of social change. It's not unlike sports. Look how long it took to get black quarterbacks.
That's true.
in the NFL.
And we're still
far longer.
And we're still having conversations about black coaches.
Yes, we are, unfortunately.
Well, since we're on the issue of different kind of perspectives, let's talk about the change in BET. We found over the past 2 years that BET has really been changing its image, so to speak. We saw that it went from BET now to Centric.
Right.
We saw that the programming in the news channel within that perspective is completely different. Can you talk a little bit about why that might be?
Well, first of all, let me say I don't follow BET very closely,
Okay.
but the change in ownership has produced a change in expectations of dealing with advertisers, and that tends to convert itself into different kind of programming. So what I see through the screen is that the ownership is much more risk averse, more conservative, if you will, not politically necessarily, but conservative in the sense of programming innovations. And so there's tended to be more of a blending so that BET looks like other channels.
I was just going to say that it seems to me that now Centric could look like a lot of different channels.
Yeah.
They're cross-populating with MTV, they're cross-populating with some stuff on CMT. It looks like a little different in terms of the conversation than it used to be.
Yes, it does.
Well, in terms of the 4 networks, we find that there's been lots of conversations over the past few years about lack of shows that really are all black-based, all Latino-based, all Chicano-based. And we can probably name 4 or 5 shows that really just represent that and kind of have fallen by the wayside, so to speak. Either folks have decided not to re-up them, or actors and large casts have decided they wanted to move on to something different. So we don't see, you know, I can't turn on CBS and watch an all-black cast. I can't turn on ABC and watch an all-Latino cast. So it's very interesting in kind of how they're addressing some of those things. Can you talk a little bit more about that?
Well, in a way, you can turn on your cable TV and see all Latino cast, but they'll be speaking in Spanish.
Right.
And so those channels are actually growing quite a bit. In a sense, you might say African Americans have integrated television more because they tend to appear with whites. In terms of all black casts, again, I think producers are just wary of going in that direction, and so they tend to hold back. And that's why the all Spanish networks work, because they're sold as a package.
Right.
So nobody's choosing the content per se, they're choosing the package, and as long as the package attracts ratings, it works pretty well.
Well, besides Latinos and blacks, we see truly an underrepresentation of Asian Americans on television in lots of different ways. You know, we can probably look at a few shows and might think 1 or 2 characters, but there just seems to be an absence of Asian America across the spectrum.
Well, yeah, I think that's probably true. Casting calls tend to visualize characters in a show in a certain way, and my guess is they're not visualizing characters as having a deal of diversity. And I think the issue is when Asians are cast, it's because the casting call called for an Asian.
Okay.
So when the casting call calls for sort of a mainstream person, producers don't think of Asians as mainstream, and so they don't tend to fit in the cast. So we will have turned the corner when a casting call for sort of an ordinary Joe can put an Asian in there, an African American in there, Hispanic, anybody in there, and that turns out to be, quote, average.
Okay. We've talked a lot about some of the problems. What are some of the recommendations or some of the things that you think we might be able to address as we move forward in a positive way?
Well, I should say my work does not make recommendations about content.
Okay.
Because content is First Amendment territory. And I tend to work in the area of access, in the area of who has access to these services and who doesn't, and what the consequences are of that access.
Okay.
This demographic wave I talked about turns out to be very important. Right. It will change the nature of media eventually because it'll begin to change the pattern of ratings. And when that happens, commercial media will begin to respond, and that's probably just around the corner.
Okay.
In terms of usage patterns, we find, for example, that Asians are probably the highest users of information technologies as a whole, so they're much more likely to have more information technologies in the home. We also find that Hispanics are by far the largest users of cell phones. Okay. In many ways, the cell phone revolution was led by them, and they ended up subsidizing everybody else, if you think about it, because the early users are the ones who pay for the network. So in that sense, they're quite different. So why do Latinos such heavy users of cell phones? Turns out that a lot of that has to do with long-distance calls. A lot of that has to do with a portion of the population that isn't set where they live, but tends to move around, and so you can move around with your cell phone, whereas you can't do that with your landline. And the communal nature of Latino families means that they invest more heavily in keeping track of each other.
Okay.
And so all of that builds up to more cell phone use.
So does cell phone use at some point then going to translate into television and print use, or is it going to be specifically more cell phone use as we move forward?
Well, that's a tough question. You know, we don't really know how it's going to play itself out. We have come out of a period where we saw television and newspapers as leading all media.
Correct.
We're entering a period where newspapers have imploded spectacularly in the last 5 years. And we're entering a period where people are spending more time in front of their screens, but not watching TV, playing video games.
Right.
And so the introduction of video games has changed the whole terrain. So for example, Americans last year spent more money on video games than they did going to the movies.
Wow. Well, I don't play video games often. I watch my niece and my nephew play them.
Yeah.
Strange thing about video games, too, is ethnic representation in video games.
Yeah, I know. It's
just kind of cyclical in lots of ways.
And you wonder how often do we have to do this cycle all over again to get things more realistic. You know, I mean, the story on video games is that the video game industry was created by a lot of white teenage suburban boys who didn't interact with anybody else other than white teenage suburban boys, and the characters that show up are variations of white suburban teenage boys.
So, well, that's all the time we have for now. Thanks for joining us. I appreciate that.
Thank you.
That's all the time we have for this edition of Breakfast at the Barracks. For more information about any of the subject we've discussed today, please visit our website at rutgers.tv. For all of us at the Rutgers Division of Continuing Studies, I'm Bill Leipold, and thanks for joining.